Thank
Lovely
you.
to speak to you all.
Excellent. So, for those people online who don't know me, my name's Jessica Metheringham, one of two co-chairs for Unlock Democracy. Luke is sitting in the front row and hopefully he can give a little wave. Hello, everybody. So we'll be doing the AGM later, but we're going to start with a conversation with Jennifer, really just about compassion in politics, how it came about, where it's going next, what the big issues are. So, Jennifer, compassion in politics, this is a campaign that many people will have heard of, but perhaps not everybody. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about it, particularly whether there was, some big event or something which pushed you to say, oh, this is the straw that's broken the camel's back. This is why I'm setting this organisation up.
Well, I've been in and around Westminster for a staggering 38 years, which really dates me. And for a long time, I thought that political parties were how we were going to find solutions. But after Brexit, I became, as I'm sure many of us in this room did, became really aware of the levels of toxicity, the polarization and the division. So that was one part of our decision to set up compassion in politics. The other part was, having been involved in a lot of single issue campaigns, I had a growing frustration because they're all actually connected. Whether your biggest heartbreak is refugees dying at sea, whether it's electoral reform, whether it's hunger, whether it's climate change, whether it's prison reform, we can't look at those issues in isolation. They are all connected, and yet within the campaign sector, it had almost become like a marketplace where each of us had our own products to sell or to persuade. And it meant that there was a lot of unnecessary competition between all of us working in the social justice and the democratic reform space. So it really came from an awareness. We thought, what's really going to shift the dial? If we do well with the single issue campaign, we will be drawing funds and supporters and attention away from another campaign that's just as valuable. So we took a step back and looked at what's the underlying thing, what's the systems change that could really help to shift the dial across all those issues that everyone in the room and online cares about. And we felt that it was an increasing the level of compassion, that if we could increase the level of compassion both in society and in politics, that would then reap dividends for every single social justice issue and the issue of electoral reform and democratic reform. So we decided to start a campaign that looked at how can we raise compassion, and if you like, if the levels of compassion are raised, then all those other little boats, the tide rises, and all those other little boats can then make headway. So that was really our thinking behind it.
Thank you. So just to let everybody know, there'll be perhaps, 2 more questions. It might be a couple more. I'm not quite sure how we'll do it, really. You will play it by ear from me. Then do put your own questions there in the chat. Grace, is there a special question answer thing? Right, so we'll get to those here. So put them in the chat. Think about them for the people in the room, and we will have them probably in about 5-10 minutes. So Jennifer, can I come in on what for me feels like one of the difficult issues with this? You're mentioning the single issue campaigns, and I completely see where you are coming from there. I completely have seen that and felt that you've got a lot of different campaigns who often feel as though they're competing, although they shouldn't be, and they aren't really. Dealing with the underlying issues is really difficult. One of the issues that I think we find with democracy campaigning can be that when it's a very focused single issue campaign, it's sometimes very simple to explain. You say, we have a campaign to save the blue whale. We have a campaign to not cut down those particular trees right there. When it's something like democracy, the same with compassion, for making things better in general, then it can sometimes feel quite nebulous, though it is really essential. So how do you deal with that that difficulty about it being such a wide, broad focus?
It's a really, really good question. And just to give you an idea about my background, so my background is I trained as a barrister and then became a journalist. So and then wrote some books whilst being an activist and campaigning. And so for me, the power of story is really, really important. And it felt to us that really since 1979 in the UK and 1981 in America, a story had been told about us, who we are as humans, that really wasn't true. We'd become units of consumption. The narrative that all of us deserved care, the social contract that had bound us together since the post-war settlement was slowly being snipped away. You know, we were fed a new narrative, a narrative that those who were in trouble were users or scroungers, you know, culminating in the shopper benefit cheat. So into this public space, you know, post-war, there was, you know, understandably an incredible awareness that we were all in it together, and that was being steadily eroded. And the lie was sold to us that all we needed was to achieve enough and to have enough, and then we would all be happy as a society. But what we know happened was that there was a hollowing out of society. There was a hollowing out of the public space, of the institutions, of the glue that binds us. So for us, the biggest story is, you know, who are we as humans? What really matters to us? And if you look, the pandemic gave us, really kind of affirmed our argument, because we saw individuals risking their lives to help others. We realized the vital nature of those who do low status jobs, but actually were the ones who kept us all alive. And it felt for a moment that we had this reawakening as to who we are, that we're kind, that we're compassionate, that we care, that we will extend ourselves, and that what matters most is human relationships. And I think many of us in this space hope that that would be an opening we could all capitalize on. And, you know, Build Back Better became the phrase until it was co-opted by the government to mean something else. So that really is what we're looking at. We're looking at what kind of a world do we all want to live in? And then it has to be broken down. So do we want to live in a world that's fair? Do we want to live in a world where everyone's voices are heard? And for us, the big piece of it is avoidable suffering. You know, we know that suffering is inevitable. It's an inevitable part of life. You know, we give birth, we're going to die, people we love will suffer, we'll have highs and lows. But there is so much more suffering, which is totally and utterly avoidable. And for me, the purpose of politics is to address that suffering. It's to reduce the amount of avoidable suffering, and it's also to protect those who are in the most vulnerable circumstances. So that was really what we were looking at. You know, how can we improve things so that those who have least are protected, and how can we ensure that the values that we hold dear are the ones that we see reflected in the public space. And of course, you know, at an increasing rate, we've seen this huge divide open up between the values most of us live with at home, with our families, with our loved ones, with our friends. You know, we don't throw our granny out because she ceased to be of economic value. We don't dissipate everything that's in our savings account. If we're lucky enough to have savings, we think about the next generation. And yet government after government has completely abandoned those rules. And so we do a lot of polling, and what we find is that there's huge public support for those values. So the argument that we often make in the political space is that it's not that the public have drifted away from politics, it's that politics has drifted away from its purpose, which is to improve the lives of citizens and to make all of our lives better and to protect who are vulnerable. And of course, you know, we've seen some incredibly cruel policies that were known. It was known that they would cause harm, and yet they were introduced. So that's another issue that we campaign on. You know, there should be what we call a compassion principle, which is that legislation that is knowingly going to push those in the most vulnerable circumstances into destitution should not be passed. There should be another way of achieving those policy objectives. So that's one part of our work. the other part of our work is how we do democracy, you know, and I'm a huge fan, and I feel very privileged to work closely with Unlock Democracy on a number of campaigns, and to work with Tom Brake, who is fantastic. But the way we do politics is not fit for purpose. You know, we have an ancient patriarchal system that was designed for a few privileged white men to govern the masses, and we've reformed it on a piecemeal basis, and it's just no longer working. And you know, when I started out as a junior reporter, there were 43 women in the House of Commons, and we now have many, many more. But the environment that women politicians are having to work in is far worse. You know, death threats, rape threats, bricks, violence, being chased down the street, those things simply weren't happening in 1990, which was when I first started reporting on democracy issues. So we know that it's not working for women, it's not working for society, and it's not working for politicians. So we want to see a shift away from a conflict-based adversarial system to one that really provides a modern and functional way of ruling this country, because the problems we have are so big that we cannot rely on an 18th century institution to deal with 21st century problems. So a lot of our work, which is, you know, the work that we're often hand in glove with Unlock Democracy on, is how do we improve our democratic functioning, because the need is urgent. And with just 9% of the public saying they trust politicians, and only 2% of young people saying they believe what politicians say is true, the need couldn't be more urgent. Oh, I can't hear you. You've gone all quiet. No, still can't hear you. Have you muted by accident? What about everyone else online? Can you hear?
Yes.
You can hear. I can hear me, but I can't hear.
You can't hear Jess.
I can't hear.
Can you hear Jeff?
I can hear you, Jennifer, but not Jess.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not the only one. That makes me feel slightly better. We're all in it together. Okay, someone else is going to have to ask
now.
Yes, got you back.
Excellent. Turned out that taking the wire out and then putting it back in again was worked a little better. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Hopefully it won't happen again, but let's see. So this will be the last question from me. So the question I was going to ask in this space was about, you know, the threats. You know, what do you see as the biggest threats to democracy? To a certain extent, you've answered that in, you know, two ways. You know, you've said that the narrative, you know, that is a big threat. You know, the narrative that we are all need to be good little workers, you know, serving our economic purpose. You've also talked about the systems. You know, you've talked about how those are entirely not fit for purpose now. You know, how that I think is also a narrative. You know, the narrative that politics has to be about conflict debate. But how do you think that these threats are, you know, how do you think that they're actually represented in a day-to-day manner? You know, when you see something online and you go, oh, that's a threat to democracy, you know, what do you think those threats manifest as?
So that's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in two ways. The first is that the part of politics that the public see is unrepresentative of how MPs work, but it is really damaging. You know, the one bit of Parliament that most of the public know and see is Prime Minister's questions. And then we have politicians saying to the public, you've got to cut back on political violence, you've got to be nice to yourself online. But we have just seen booing, jeering, lampooning, undermining behaviours that would not be allowed in any workplace. So I'm in no doubt that politics very, very quickly needs to tackle its huge publicity, but it has two PR problems. One is the absence of proportional representation, and the other is a complete lack of insight into how it's perceived and how what paths for traditions are really just bullying and totally inappropriate ways of working. I remember having one stand-up row with the former Home Secretary, Matt Hancock, and he said, well, that's how we test our ideas. That's how we get the feel of it. And I said, well, then why doesn't every global organization have a debating chamber in its boardroom? If that's the most efficient way to run an organization, then why isn't it replicated? Anyway, so that's one side. But coming to society, I think we're in a really, really dangerous position. And I think what has happened in America, and also in Austria, in Germany, what nearly happened in France and Spain, is really a wake-up call. Something has been unleashed post-Brexit, post-Trump, and I don't think that rearranging the deck chairs of democracy alone is going to be enough. I think that, within all of us humans, we have the capacity to hate, and we have the capacity to love. And normally, over the last few decades, it has felt that society is evolving and we're stepping out of hate and more towards love. And hate has been legitimized, greed has been legitimized, othering has been legitimized, self-interest has been legitimized, and the genie is out of the bottle. And how we get it back in the bottle is going to take a lot of organization. It's going to take a lot of working at grassroots and community level. So we now have this bifocal approach that's needed, democracy reforming itself so that it can no longer be accused of being remote and unrelatable to, and a class of people who are not answerable or who are privileged. So we need to deal with that. But at the same time, we have to really connect at a very deep level and at a community level, and rebuild the structures and the connections that have been hollowed out. Because unless we do that, hate is addictive. It's empowering those of us who feel disempowered, and those of us in the center and center left suffer from the same thing. Righteous indignation, doesn't that make us feel good? Doesn't that make us feel powerful? Doesn't that make us feel right? So all of us are capable of it, and capable of stepping into anger and righteousness, because that gives us a false sense of agency and power in a situation in which we feel powerless. And so until we can, until we can put down our kind of banner of rightness and actually start connecting across the divide, I think we're in for a bumpy ride.
Thank you. There's definitely something about knee-jerk reactions there. These are the reactions which we all have. They are not necessarily our best reactions, and they don't necessarily reflect who we actually are inside. Now, there were a couple of comments which I saw come up in the chat, and can I combine a couple of them? There's one, I think the first one I saw come up about tribal behavior. Grace, have you got the actual text there? Aha. Now I am a two-device person. Politics exemplifies tribal behavior. And so Dave is talking about how it is a very typical sort of playground primary school behavior. Does it help to describe something like that? Because it's a very human behavior, but does it help to describe tribal behavior there about saying that this is a human behavior, but it is a playground primary school behavior? Can we talk about this as a way of bringing people together rather than separating them? So tribal behavior, how can we use that?
So first of all, I think that's a really excellent question, and I think it's at the heart of the problem. And we've just made a report to the Modernisation Committee looking at the ways that we can de-escalate. Essentially, politics is triggered if if you don't mind me using a psychological expression, and most political actors are in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is the state you're in when you're in a conflict-based situation and you have to defend yourself. Great if you're in the plains of Africa about to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, but not as appropriate. But unfortunately, as all of you in the room will know, our psychology hasn't evolved at the same space as the way that we live. So, so how can we de-escalate from that tribalism? Well, the first thing is that most of the habits and traditions we've got in the commons that are so jealously regarded feed that tribalism. Let's look at the whipping system. You know, the very name, the whipping system. You know, at its worst, and obviously there are many people, many whips who haven't behaved in this way and have taken on more of a pastoral role. But at its worst, the whipping system is really a system of bribery and threats and corruption. And in any other walk of life, it would be seen for what it was, which is inappropriate bullying, inducing people to do things by offering financial, you know, a school or whatever it is, if they follow, or career advancement. So for me, I'm not saying that we don't need party discipline, but let's just get rid of those practices that really feed the conflict base. So let's get rid of whipping and look at a more sophisticated way of having party discipline. The other thing we need to tackle is that in other walks of life, there are laws against fraudulent misrepresentation, and yet in the political sphere, there are no rules. And we're very excited about a law that we drafted that has been now accepted by the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, which would create an offence of deliberate misrepresentation by politicians, only in the most extreme cases. But for example, if you wanted to put a figure on the side of a bus that was known to be inaccurate, and when you were told it was inaccurate, you didn't remove it and you repeated it, you would then be disqualified from running for office under this law. And I think there are, you know, I spoke in quite a bleak way about the point that we're in terms of history, but there are two things that we can do. One is modernize our democracy, modernize, make it functional, learn from business, learn from other democratic forms. And the second is defend our democracy. And that means putting in really tight guardrails. It means we will not have conduct that in any other sphere would be unacceptable. We will have, you know, enforceable codes that govern truth-telling, that govern behavior, that govern bullying, that govern harassment. All of these things have no place in a modern parliament. So that twin track, and, you know, I know that most of you in the room are part of Unlock Democracy because of its really important work in this space. But that's really what I see. Tribalism is a problem. You know, to quote Joe Cox, you know, we have more in common than that which divides us, and we have to grow. You know, if we focus on our differences, we will polarize. If we focus on what we have in common, we have to grow that common ground, and it can start in a really small way, but we have to grow it and grow it and grow it. You know, if you look at the nature of political debate, you know, if we want to solve a problem like hunger, like child hunger, then we should be focusing on what's the effective solution to do that. But often we find ourselves in an ideological tug of war and a binary fight over one ideology versus another ideology, and whichever one wins, the other has no representation. And often ideological solutions are not the answer because things are so much more complex, and they don't reduce down to really simplistic solutions that are the fodder of parliamentary debate and newspaper dialogue. So it's how can we allow the space for complexity? How can we de-trigger? How can we de-escalate? How can we collaborate? How can we allow our leaders not to know? How can we allow our political leaders to experiment, to say, I'm not sure this is going to work, but I'm going to give it a go? Can you imagine a leader in the current charged environment doing that? But that is what we need.
Thank you. There are a lot of bits there I wanted to pull out as a little quote and, you know, frame and put somewhere. Could I have some questions in the room, maybe? Okay, I see David at the back. Now, if I move this, there's a possibility you could suddenly stop hearing us, but I'm going to risk it. I'm hoping you can still hear us.
Yeah, is this loud enough to hear? So thank you. It's really interesting. I guess the question I had, and I think you've touched on this, is how much work should we be doing challenging our own sides when behaviour deviates from the values we're expressing? Because I think compassionate policies are really important, but I think we've seen that, you know, so-called progressive voices are just as good as the extreme we see, as you said, in terms of othering groups. And I think the lessons we've learned from the last year, and certainly the last fortnight, is that telling an increasing number of the population that they are beyond the pale, that the concerns they express don't deserve an open discussion, but, you know, should be, you know, cancelled or for whatever word, but basically telling people that there's no room for conversation. I feel that's happened from both sides now. So I mean, how much do you think we need to challenge that before we can kind of actually move policies we're espousing forward?
Thank you.
I think you've raised a really important point, and there's a beautiful quote from the Sufi poet Rumi, which is, "Out beyond talk of right and wrong, there is a field and I will meet you there." And the moment we focus on our rightness and someone else's wrongness, you know, all bets are off. We remain in stasis. And, you know, I'm going to use some more you know, learning from psychology, the science of neuroscience and psychology, which is what we focus on grows. So we need to focus on the positive. We need to focus on where we want to be. And we need to reduce our focus. It's right to say, you know, I have to bring mothering in here as a mother of 3 boys, having lived through 3 teenage years. You got to focus on what they're doing right. You have got to focus on that. And a bit, as I said, with the common ground, you've got to build out from there. But the thing that I think is really missing at the moment is a vision. You know, right now we're being told that things are dreadful, that things are terrible, that everyone's got to knuckle down, that there's no room to speak up for those who might not be able to afford to heat themselves, that's disloyal. You know, we're in this extraordinary situation where we're not allowed to talk about love. We're not allowed to talk about caring. And we need to, you know, what kind of a Britain do we want to live in? You know, there are things that cost nothing, but which transform lives. And those are connection, love, and compassion. And unless we have a vision of where we're moving towards, those hardships are really, really difficult to tolerate. When we have a vision, we have hope. And when we have hope, we have agency. But at the moment, we have no vision. So hope is scarce. And in the absence of hope, we have people coming along selling candy floss. And even though it's going to rot our teeth, we grab the candy floss of extremism because it's better than the no hope of the centre ground.
Thank you. That's another quote we should put on a poster somewhere. There are a couple of comments in the chat which I think again go together, and both are about how the government has belittled campaigners. Well, you know, when we talk about belittling campaigners, that makes us think of, you know, what the government was saying about campaigners 6 or 7 years ago with getting back to your knitting, whereas I think now we're in a state where we've actually had, you know, legislation against many of the ways in which many organisations campaign. So, firstly, to what extent has that been deliberate, and to what extent has that been accidental, you know, do you think, from the government? But also, well, I suppose, you know, how did we get here and how do we get out of that situation?
So you mentioned the role of the media, and the role of the media is really, really important. There's a symbiotic relationship between the media and politics, and having been, you know, a national journalist for BBC and ITV and Channel 4 News, you know, we report stories, and the definition of a story is conflict-based, it's power-driven, there's jeopardy. And often we as campaigners don't realize that we can become part of that symbiotic relationship if we provide narratives that meet the media's needs. So that's one part of it. And that doesn't mean that we distort or misrepresent it, but I think there's a real tendency amongst us to adopt a victim mentality with the media and say, well, they're not interested, there's nothing we can do. Actually, we've got to work out how to engage them and how to do that. And, you know, the post office scandal is a fantastic example of how a story and a narrative can completely dominate the headlines and achieve incredible good, not quickly enough. So there are ways of working with the media. You know, I just want to bring up an anecdote that I heard Richard Layard, Professor, well, Lord Layard, who, you know, was the founding economist behind the economics of happiness. And he tells this story about an American, First Nations American elder with his granddaughter. And he says to his granddaughter, did you know that you've got two wolves fighting inside you? And one of the wolves is really angry and nasty and greedy and selfish and envious and wants everything everyone else has got and wants to hurt people. And the other wolf is gentle and generous and kind and sweet-natured and happy. And she says, but Grandpa, which wolf is going to win? And he says, whichever wolf you feed. And we've been feeding the wrong wolf. And we need to start feeding the right wolf really, really quickly.
Thank you. That anecdote is often reported, but without the feeding bit. So I think that's a useful point. More questions in the room? Can I go to Peter and then I'll ask Tom? Can we hear Peter?
And how loudly I speak.
Can you hear Peter? Maybe I will ask Luke if he can hand that back.
Hi, Peter.
Hello. Thanks, that's very interesting. Can you hear me all right now then?
Perfect. You're loud and clear.
I think, you know, I think we are a fairly compassionate society, really. And when you look at Band Aid, that's going back a bit, but people do show their compassion when they get the opportunity. We're, as a society too, I think we're very good at analysing what's wrong. You know, almost it's our nature, but we're not as good at sort of solving. Once we've analysed the problem, we seem to think that's the end of it, and there's no need to do anything about it. So when I listen to you, I do wonder whether we all agree that compassion is a good quality in life and in politics, but what is the best way of getting that is what I'm asking. And I see something like an organisation, Compassion in Politics. You know, are you sure you're actually contributing to the desired end, or are you neutral? Are you diluting? Because to me, PR is so vital that it will alter the culture of our politics and make it more compassionate in itself. So shouldn't you be putting all your resources into getting PR rather than having a separate organisation?
I agree, and we work with you guys in favour of PR. You know, one of the things I should have said is that we really believe in working as a coalition. So absolutely we want PR, but what are we going to do while we wait for PR? Well, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll introduce a law to prevent political deception. That's happening in Wales. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll get Parliament modernised. You know, our report has gone in very favourably received that talks about real measures that will change the way democracy functions while we're waiting for PR to happen. And PR is more likely to happen if we reduce some of that tribalism and reduce some of that conflict. I'll tell you what else we're doing. We're looking at really practical on the ground ways of applying compassion. You know, at the last Conservative budget, there was a rise in the living wage that came almost directly from work we did behind the scenes with some members of the Conservative Party who didn't like what was happening. During the pandemic, the Everyone In policy brought all homeless people in. Meanwhile, women, mainly women who were trapped in violent relationships, refuges closed, and there was no way they could get in. So we work with hotels to give space for free to those fleeing domestic violence, and we house women and children. So we are really practical, and it's easy when you have a title like compassion in politics because it sounds woolly, but there is no point in us existing unless we are achieving visible change. That doesn't mean we don't want PR. That I've been fighting for electoral reform since the mid-1980s, but it means we're going to do a lot else besides, and we're not just going to wait for that to happen and leave everyone suffering while we do.
Thank you. My impression is often that there are lots of these organisations. I like to think of them as firstly being lots of little Venn diagrams, and they all overlap, and you get something which, eventually looks a bit like a necklace, because this one overlaps with that one, and that one overlaps with that one, and then you end up with something where you think, oh, okay, working together, we can finally, come in on this problem. But it often works with having multiple small things working on very slightly different approaches than one big battering ram, which inevitably breaks.
And if I can come in on that, you're absolutely right. And the metaphor I use is similar. It's the metaphor of an orchestra, which is that each of us in the democracy space, and each of us have campaigners, have one instrument that we play really, really well. But if we don't have a conductor, if we don't work in coalition with each other, sorry, that's my son ringing me. If we don't work in coalition, we will drown out each other. So, and Unlock Democracy are part of a coalition that we were with the Democracy Network, and we work with Unlock on the Clean Up Politics campaign. And what that means is that all of those organisations, when there's an action on proportional representation, we will all pile in behind whoever's leading on that. When there's an action on, say, reforming Parliament so that women can be better represented, everyone will pile in on that. And it's a fantastic way of working. And I feel really pleased with the changes I've seen during the last 5 years in the way that the democracy sector organises, collaborates and supports each other.
Thank you. Thank you also for Peter for starting off, that question. That was really interesting. Can I ask Tom, then I'll go to, so Tom, then back to you, Jennifer, then I'll go to an online question.
Thanks, Jess, and thank you, Jennifer, for doing this for us. Jess, you mentioned working better with the government. So first of all, it's worth flagging that the government are working with civil society around a civil society covenant that would, in the Prime Minister's words, reset the relationship with civil society. So I think there's a recognition from government that relationship is not a particularly strong one. But the government's focus is on the civil society helping deliver the 5 missions. So I wanted to ask you, Jennifer, can you perhaps in a few concrete ways explain how more compassion would help the government deliver their 5 missions?
Oh, Tom, you know that I can't actually summon the 5 missions to why don't you give me one and I'll hazard an answer. Give us a mission, so we, just in case anyone else like me hasn't committed them to memory and doesn't have a tattoo of them on their arm.
A couple of them. So, basically a focus on the NHS. So basically reforming the NHS, delivering more appointments and so on. And the other one is achieving the most growth out in the G7, I think. So those are 2 examples of the missions.
Thanks.
So if I can take the second one first, I have a real problem with the use of the word growth when it isn't qualified, when we know what's happening in our planet as a result of unbridled growth. And I'm really disappointed that Labour aren't talking about sustainable growth or inclusive growth or regenerative growth. So compassion would say the growth that we have cannot come at the expense of the planet or the global south. So growth is one thing. That compassion would also say that we should be looking at different economic metrics, that we should look at well-being measures. If we continue, what we focus on grows. If we continue to focus on GDP and growth, we will get more of what we've had. We need to shift to what actually improves the quality of our life, which is well-being. So that's So compassion would say, I hear you about growth, but let's just try and reshape that, you know, and it doesn't take that much to change course just a little bit. So that's what I would say on there. And on the NHS, you know, the NHS was founded on compassion, on the belief that everyone should be cared for from cradle to the grave. And so compassion, first of all, would support the NHS remaining in the hands of the government and the nation. And compassion would also look at how the NHS operates. You know, we've had some very uncompassionate neoliberal policies coming into the way the NHS has run, you know, the number of temporary workers, the amount of contracting out. And as a result of that, we have people who are working in really intolerable circumstances, and the system's crumbling. So there's a lot of research being done at the moment. You probably know him, Professor Michael West, part of the King's Fund, is doing a lot of work within the NHS on compassionate leadership, on how do we lead in ways that recognises that many of those who are working in the NHS are confronted on a daily basis by traumatic situations. They're stuck between a system that is squeezing the last ounce of life out of them, and patients who are in dire straits and whom they don't have enough resources to help. So we need to look at leadership and systems within it, as well as prioritizing it in terms of funding and in terms of protecting it from, you know, terrible policies like the PFI initiative, which we're still struggling with the financial consequences of.
That's actually a really good place to jump off to the next question, because it's about how many of our problems trace back to money, which could be dark money, it could be, you know, the money which is coming in to politics, but also how many of them trace back to funding initiatives that people thought were a good idea and turned out not to be, you know, to people thinking that such and such a thing will, you know, will make them more money. You know, so there are a couple of questions which were asked about this. So do our problems from the way we do our politics, to what extent do they come from money?
Such a good question. So the first thing I would say is that money is a fantastic servant and a terrible master. And really, we have been worshipping in Mammon's temple as a society and as a culture. So money has had far too big an impact on how we all live, and we've seen it as an end in itself rather than the mechanism by which we can make ourselves safe and live happy and fulfilling lives. And the problem with money is that we never have, when is enough enough? You know, those of us who know people with plenty of money know that enough is never enough. And that kind of wealth acquisition is bred out of fear. And anything that is bred out of fear doesn't by and large work well. And of course, if we live in a society where money is the currency, then those who have most money will have most power and most influence. And that is certainly the case in politics. Those of us, those who have access to Downing Street are those who have the funds to enable governments to fulfill their policies. And that again is a dangerous situation. And of course, dark money as well. And things like, you know, who gets appointed to the House of Lords. While we have the House of Lords in its current form, you know, the whole honours system, it's completely open to corruption, because money is seen as the answer to every ill we have, whereas really often it's part of it.
Thank you. This is another question which has come up online, but it's about the UK population. You know, how much do the UK population know about politics? So this always leads into a question about general ignorance, which generally leads into saying, well, you know, let's educate people. So I suppose my question is, how much is that a problem? But also, does it then sound patronising if we're saying, let's go and educate people about this? You know, particularly if we're talking not about children, but about adults. You know, how can we reach out to people and tell them things when we don't want to be patronising?
Really good question. Well, I don't think it's about ignorance. That's the first thing. I do think that we need much better civic education. I made a program for BBC Radio called Broken Politicians, Broken Politics back in May, and it's still on iPlayer, and it talks a lot about this, how people have unrealistic expectations of what members of parliament can do, and that has, you know, fueled a mental health crisis amongst those who work in politics. So I just want to say that civic education is really, really important. But I think we're really in a naive place if we think that it's ignorance that led to people voting for Trump, just in the same way as we think it was ignorance that led to people voting for Brexit. I remember talking to one Labour MP who'd been campaigning in pro-Brexit areas before the referendum, and she'd been in a car factory, and she said the thing is that Brexit's going to ruin just-in-time production. She thought all she needed to do was to explain to these factory workers that just-in-time production lines would go, and the foreman put up his hand and said, of course we fucking know that. You know, it's not that people don't know, it's that they've had it. They've had it from a system which is remote, which doesn't meet their needs, and which doesn't give them what they need as humans. So there we come back to story, we come back to values, we come back to what matters, we come back to equity, we come back to not having, you know, a super wealthy elite that lives in a completely different stratosphere to the rest of us. We come back to huge multinational companies that don't pay tax. We come back to all of those things. So you know, America was angry, and it went for the candidate who was going to smash things, and that's not about education. That's about a visceral, you know, we're really, I don't want to say we're living in a beyond truth age, but facts are not going to win the arguments we have right now. They are emotional. They are beyond truth. They're about our visceral, psychological response to the environment we find ourselves in, and we need to find solutions on that plane as well.
So, hang on just a moment, but that will definitely come back to you. Can I ask, or can I add on to that I am not necessarily convinced, and people might disagree, that that's a problem. That people, you know, so a lot of people say, oh, people have not voted with their heads. They voted with their hearts. They haven't, you know, they haven't applied logic. They haven't voted for what's best for them. Well, that's a problem. They're not being logical about it. They should be logical, you know, stop voting with your anger. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced that that is a problem. And I think actually we want people to vote with their emotions as well as their heads. But as you say, it's about tapping in perhaps to the better part of their heart rather than the anger.
Yeah, and it's about having a vision. You know, if you have a choice between, you know, really tough times where everyone's going to have to suck in their belt and worry about how their granny's going to heat their house, you're not going to be popular. If you have a narrative which is about, this is where we're headed, we're going to return Britain to being a nation that cares, that looks after, and we will have to do that in steps. We will have to do that in increments. But we haven't got that kind of leadership coming from the government at the moment. We've got, you know, a very fear-based form of government that completely ignores our psychological and emotional needs. And it's both and, you know, we need competency, but we also need our psychological needs for a sense of agency, hope, purpose, and meaning met.
So take the fear out of politics, the fear and the anger out, but replace it with compassion rather than replacing it with cold logic.
Yeah, and I think
that would be my interpretation.
I love that, but we have to look at what our human needs are. You know, psychology is the elephant in the room of politics. We act as if we're not psychological beings, but we all need to be seen. We need to be known. We need to have a sense of agency. We need to have a sense of hope. We need to have a sense of productivity. We need to have a sense of safety. So if we are not being offered that, we will go to where it is being offered. Enter Trump. I'm going to end war. I'm going to make you great. You don't need to worry about imports, you know, and then that narrative, if you're starving of the essential psychological diet, then you're going to reach for the candy floss.
Thank you. David's already asked a question. I'm going to go down here. Hello.
So I'd love to hear your opinion on the rise, which I've never thought how to cope with it, to be truthful, the rise of nationalist populism. Your three basic ideas how to counter that. Because if you listen to someone who fires off like that, they come up with massive exaggeration, a lot of bluster, rapid talking, covering many subjects in 1 minute, and a whole load of half truths and untruths, and it sort of it bullies people into following down that simple solutions, simple route of everything's very easy to solve. And I'd love three things perhaps of how one could counter this populist nationalism, which is rising in the Western world, and it is quite likely to cause the fall of the rules-based order at the rate we're going.
Thank you.
But that's an excellent question, and I agree with your analysis. The first thing is that we, as I said earlier, we need to have proper rules. So we need to defend democracy from lies and mistruth. And up until now, we've said, oh, this is an issue of free speech. But free speech is pointless if you have a public space that is so polluted by the virus of untruth that you don't even know which way's up and which way's down. So we need to put really, really firm guardrails in, is number one. Number two is that we need to have an alternative vision and an alternative offer which meets those needs as well. And that's about who we are as a nation. You know, I don't want to feed, my father was a Jewish refugee who fled as a child from the Holocaust. So I know what happens when nationalism takes hold. But there's a story about our identity, about who we are. You know, we are a nation that had the kinder transfer. We are a nation that founded the National Health Service. We are a nation that has done so many great things. And we don't talk about that. You know, who are the British? You know, we're the people who'll make you a cup of tea. We're the people who'll come out during the pandemic and get your shopping, even though it may risk our own lives. We need that story told. That's who we are. And that's feeding the better wolf, to go back to that metaphor. And the third thing that we need is connection. We need to connect all the time, because connection is the antidote to hate. You know, hate is born out of that vacuum of psychological need. And there is a lot of research that is done on the value of connection in creating resilient communities. And, you know, I don't know how many of you are reading Timothy Snyder at the moment, the Yale historian, but his fantastic little book that came out a few years ago called On Tyranny has one chapter about, you know, the ultimate defense against the rise of the right and the defense against tyranny. You know, when a government has fallen, when an army has been captured, when a police force has been captured, what determines whether or not a community will survive is its resilience. And its resilience starts with the level of connection between citizens. And there's some fantastic modalities that we're working on and trying to get rolled out that have a huge amount of research and science behind them. But we really need to look at grassroots resilience born out of human connection.
Thank you. We have 6 minutes left on this, looking at the times here. There's a hand that's been raised for quite a long time here on the Zoom chat, which I am only just seeing because unfortunately the top bit of the screen has a banner on it for us here, which we've only just seen. Could I ask whether Bob then could speak? Bob, you're muted at the moment, but if you could unmute yourself. Oh, does that work? Will that work? Oh, I'm not. See, these are the intricacies of Zoom. This is why we ask people to put questions in the chat, unfortunately.
Right.
Oops,
Oh,
he's there.
Bob,
Right.
you're there.
I think one of the biggest problems that we face is that MPs, once they get into Parliament, they think that they're representing themselves. They're not representing the people that that elected them and put them there, and they look after their own self-interest. And there's no discipline within Parliament whereby they can be thrown out, where they can be thrown out of office. I mean, the expenses scandal was horrific, and you have people claiming for things that you couldn't claim for if you worked in business. I've been on expense accounts, and if I tried to claim for breakfast, even if I was away from home, that wouldn't work. I mean, you've got people claiming for whole houses down in London when they only live 19 miles from Parliament. All this kind of nonsense, and that really does get through to people.
Thanks, Bob. That's a really good point, actually, about the previous expenses scandal, but also the general, who are people representing? Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're right, and that fuels the public lack of trust. And so the first thing I would say, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which was putting up the guardrail so that that kind of behavior can't happen. And we need to introduce really strict reforms. We do have a recall mechanism now. But the other thing I would say is that one of the other things that prevents individual MPs really representing the views of their constituency is the whipping system and party discipline. So, we've seen what happened. I'm talking about the Labour government because they're in power now. I'm not saying that this is a Labour problem more than it is any other party. But, we've seen what happens to those individuals who decide to represent the views of their constituencies or their conscience. They have the whip removed. So we don't have a system, and these are the reforms that we would like to see, which allows people to completely represent their constituencies or their conscience. We have a system which is based around the dominance of one party over the other, which comes back to proportional representation and the binary nature of our system.
Thank you. Just to say that I said a moment ago it was 5 minutes ago. That's because I had forgotten we were going for an hour and 15 minutes, not an hour. Yes, sorry about that, folks. We've actually got 15 minutes from now. So I think that means there's probably time for 2 more questions in the room and 2 more online. So in the room, I see 2 hands. Let's take the 2 questions at once. Can I have the lady here and then Catherine after that?
Hello. Do you not think that a lot of the problems is that the can I put dictators in inverted commas come out strong? They give hope to people who think there is no hope, and in that split second they've won the person over. However, there is no narrative about the fact what happens to dictators. Stalin was poisoned, communism fell, Mussolini was hung, we don't know what's happening in Syria, etc., etc. So surely, to counterbalance this, there must be better education on it, better education on the history. You've got your history, I've got my history, but people don't want to know it nowadays. If I speak to our children, about my mother who happened to be Polish, etc., etc., but it's not relevant to them. It must be made relevant. They must. Somehow we've got to get the message across that when history goes bad, as I say, it really goes bad. And there's a history, there's a cycle of these wretched people.
Telling the whole story. Yeah. Can I come back to Jennifer, then I'll come to Catherine.
Yeah, you're making me think of, that famous Santayana quote, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to relive it." And it's incredibly depressing watching how we have not learned. But I think there are factors at play. The factors at play are, you know, how long it is since the war, so that people have forgotten what genuine hardship looks like. And we've lost our gratitude. We have lost our gratitude as a society. We have become dominated by what we want and haven't got rather than what we have. And that is another factor. So I agree that we need better education, but I don't think that alone is going to do it, because if we don't value what we've got, we're not going to protect it.
Thank you. Can I pass this back to Catherine? Oh, sorry, I just stood. Catherine's going to come forward.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to, couple of points. One, I'd quite like to take issue with your view of whipping. I've served in a parliament where we had PR, and we had to have whipping because if you want to count on a political group's support, where we have to work for support, we need to work together. But that was done after a lot of discussion in the political group, and that group would come to a consensus, and that we would then agree to follow that line, and that essentially is whipping. So it's not whipping per se, it's the type of whipping. What we have in the UK Parliament in Westminster is a top-down, you will do as you're told, and not all political groups do the discussion behind the scenes. So I just wanted to be a bit more nuanced about doing away with whipping, because it's quite necessary. My focus in my political life has been on the environment, and hugely frustrating. The population knows climate change is happening. We all know that the planet is in trouble. Even the deniers actually know that the planet is in trouble. You know, the deniers in Florida know that their buildings were blown away and flooded quite recently as a result of warming seas. And yet, when we try and bring in mitigation measures, the population don't want it. And that is a real problem for politicians to convince people that it's we cannot keep consuming. We cannot keep building more and more and have a quality of life that we have now, because the planet cannot support that for the number of people that are on the planet. I work in Oxford, and we are trying to keep the traffic out of Oxford so that the buses run better, which is less polluting and the rest of it. But the voters want to use their cars. They want to get in and nip round to the schools and do the rest of it. So it's very difficult. They know in their heads, they know in their hearts that it's scary, climate change. But changing their behaviour is the toughest thing. And I don't know how we square that as politicians, delivering what we know we should do. Van Rompuy, I think it was said, we know what to do, we just don't know how to get elected afterwards.
Sometimes you don't do it as well. But yes, square that circle.
So just very quickly on the whipping, I deliberately said, I agree with you that party discipline is necessary. I said that we have to get rid of whipping. We should stop calling it whipping, and we should make sure that it follows the ethical codes of conduct and legal codes of conduct that would be necessary in any other environment. So it's not that we don't need party organisation and party discipline, it's how we go about it that's the issue. And, you know, I'm sorry, maybe it's because I'm a journalist, but, you know, the first thing to do is stop calling it whipping. You know, it's just ridiculous. Anyway, we'll let that go. So I don't disagree. There's no disagreement with you on that. And I've just been at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference where there are 700 parliamentarians from across the Commonwealth. And it was fantastic hearing different forms of government that operate very effectively. And often a lot of them are consensus-based methods. On the environment, we have had an abject failure of leadership, and you know, I've been arguing for a very long time that we need the sort of leadership we had during the war. You know, it took roughly 8 months to turn this country into a country that was, you know, producing and directed towards war, and that was done through courageous leadership. We have leadership that reflects public opinion polling rather than leads public opinion polling. So we need to be galvanized. You know, the irony is that the right are using a lot of the techniques that actually we need to use. You know, we need to have a simple sense of purpose. And the environment for me is one of the clear ways in which, if we really, really led for the severity of the situation that is at hand, if we made it our priority, if everything flowed between it, we would galvanize, or we could galvanize enough. But that will depend on the quality of leadership and how courageous and inspiring that leadership is. But it's necessary, and it's an abject failure that our governments haven't gone far enough.
Thank you. So let's see if there are any questions from people who want to speak online, because that was less logistically difficult than feared. But also there's a good point put in the chat online by Paul, who's talking about the neglect of environmental priorities that has often come from lobbying, from media disinformation. You know, he says particularly right-wing media disinformation, though personally I'm not convinced that it's one side of the spectrum, although one side may be doing it more. So what do you think, Jennifer, about the effect that lobbying has and the effect that disinformation has on politics? Deliberate disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, they both, Paul, thank you. And I completely agree with you. You know, the oil industry has absolutely made merry, and you know, it's absolutely wrong. And it's also wrong, I think, that we have people who have been in Parliament then going to work for lobbyists and using the positions that they've had as elected Democrats to then earn money persuading their former colleagues to do things. The same at a local level, you know, the revolving door between planning officers and building developers. All of that, you know, again, it comes back to, let's put in guard rules. Let's stop thinking that the political class is exceptional and doesn't need the same guard rules that the rest of us need in our daily lives. So it's about applying professional standards as we would to any other profession. It's professionalizing politics. Any other profession would have those rules, and yet politics doesn't. And disinformation, you know, we are in a really, really, really dangerous space with disinformation. And, you know, Hannah Arendt wrote about it a long time ago. It's not just that we don't know what's true, it's what happens to our purchase on reality when that happens. And I'll try and find the quote because it might be a good place to end on, but it's really absolutely terrifying. But there again, sorry, I'm making it sound really simple, but sometimes the answers are a lot more simple than they seem. You know, why are we allowing social media companies to operate as if they aren't publishers? You know, why aren't we legislating to prevent that? That Brazilian judge who stopped X in its tracks for a period of time, how come one Brazilian judge can stop X working in Brazil, and yet we're just powerless to stop the tide of sewage that is pouring into our public space and poisoning all of us? You know, it's just an absolutely terrible, terrible situation, and we're not powerless, and we have to start believing that, and we have to start acting, and we have to start telling our political leaders that we want that to happen.
There's a difference, I think, there between between what we think the norm is versus what a true neutral would be. You know, quite often we say, well, you know, these people need subsidies, these people need to be, you know, some regulations against them. Quite often these are the same things, but we're calling them different things because one of them has been there for so long that we forget that it's not natural, you know, that it's not neutral to do that. There's actually very little in politics which is truly neutral. It's all been chosen at some point by someone.
Yes, and I'm just seeing Stephen Carter putting in here that support for local media is vital. I've also put the Hannah Arendt quote in there, which really sums it up. You know, that absolutely right. Local media remains the most trusted source of media, and yet we see money moving away from it. You know, we have the Byline Times and the Byline Times Network, which is doing a fantastic job, but we need investment in local media, because that is the one place that people do still have some trust.
That feels like it is a good place to end. We are a few minutes early, but we have had a really interesting discussion, and it feels like actually, you know, perhaps Jennifer, you know, perhaps if there's any key message you want to leave us with, a summary of some of your main points, you know, this would be a great place to say, oh, actually, go out and do this. You know, what should we do? What are our next steps? What would you like us to all go and do?
What a lovely question, and thank you so much for having me along. I think the first thing is not to let go of hope and to realize that there are solutions, that most of these problems, there are solutions, there are things that can be done. You know, despair invites us to give up. Despair tells us that there's nothing to be done, and that's the worst lie of all. There is always something to be done. And just a really simple action that everyone could take is to go onto the Compassion in Politics website and obviously sign up to our newsletter whilst remaining a loyal member of Unlocked Democracy, because we're partners.
Thank you.
On the website there, you will also see the Civility Pledge campaign. And this is a really, really simple action, which is about trying to change the public space. It's a pledge that Tom, in fact, when he was a member of Parliament, was one of those who signed up. Many thanks for that, Tom. It's just a very simple pledge which says, I'm not going to act like the rest of you. I'm going to behave in a courteous, respectful, civil, honest, kind, inclusive, compassionate way. I mean, how radical can you get? But it's for everyone in the political space. So please go online, sign up to it, share it, get other people to sign up to it, because you know, one of the things that we know that we have control of it is our own actions. And the more of us that say, no, we're not going down that path of hate, even though the rush of rightness and vindication may be quite addictive, we're not going to do that. We're going to stand in our truth and in our decency. And that's who we are, and that's how we're going to be behaving. We're not going to be led into conflict and binary polarized thinking.
Thank you. So let's try to keep our knee-jerk reactions to the few moments. Well, most of us have them. Let's try to keep them to that sort of, you know, oh, what is this? You know, and then say, oh, actually, what's my real opinion on this? Let's also try to act in good faith. You know, I think that's the most that we can all do. You know, say, actually, we are acting in good faith on this. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you for coming to speak to us. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We've got our yes, thank you.